Second. So I want to let everyone know that we are recording this. So if you don't want your image on the recording, please turn it off just so you're aware of it. So, okay, go ahead, John. Sorry.
Cool, no problem. I'm the coordinator of Concatenation Convention. It's about our 5th year doing this thing. We've had guests everywhere from Walter Mosley to Andy Weir to John Ostrander. And then we've had different professors from the university present on different stuff. This year, we're doing reanimation. And about a month into it, I was like, hey, there's something I really like about reanimation. It's Swamp Thing and the art of Steve Bissette on Swamp Thing. So I'm so lucky to have him here, and we're excited to talk with him. Our website is jacksonconcon.org. We'll have it in the box, so you can go view this afterwards if you want to review what Steven's shared with us or check out any of our past stuff. We had John McCrae, who drew a bunch of cool stuff for us. We've got lectures from different people. So we invite you to explore all the content. I know you're here for Steve and for Swamp Thing, but there's a lot of stuff on the site. I'm going to let the professors introduce themselves. Then we'll do a brief introduction of Stephen, and then Stephen will be out the gate. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve Tuckey. Go ahead, Steve.
Hey, my name is Steve Tuckey. I'm a professor of mathematics, statistics, and natural science at Jackson College. And I'm just thrilled to be here and thrilled to have a terrific guest speaker with us today. We've had a great and very diverse group of speakers on the topic of reanimation. We had a speaker a little while ago talk to us about this terrific book, if you ever get a chance to see it, How to Make a Zombie. It's a terrific book, and it's all about kind of the real life scientific explorations of what does a reanimation look like, and how have we tried to reanimate living things in the past. So it's really fascinating. So you can take a look at the interview with the author for that, Frank Swain, on our website. And I encourage you to check out all the stuff that we put out and enjoy the show today. So, Steve.
All right.
Well, my name is Stephen Albie-Scott. I am a professor of geography, geology, biology, earth science, ecology. I like doing that because Steve always does that. But anyway, so yeah, I'm very interested in listening to Stephen talk, so I'm going to keep it short. I would like you guys to know that we also had John McCrae come and give a talk, who Stephen, I think, knows, and we can have this opportunity for you to see him draw Black Panther rapidly, because we videotaped it and then we sped it up. It's a really interesting process. Anyway, so have a good time. Turn it back over to you, John.
All right. Yeah, so we're really excited to have him here. I was telling Stephen when we did some pre-interviewing, Annual #2 is one of my favorite comics of all time. My brother and I read it so much it fell apart. We had 3 of them, so we just tore them to pieces, and loved the art and loved the work with Tuttle Ben and loved all the stuff from Spider Baby Graphics. Just real quick introduction. Steve's been around for a bit, has been at the Kubert School, was in the graduating class with Rick Veach and Tom Yates. He worked at the Center for Cartoon Studies just until recently. He's a new retiree, so congratulations to him. He's worked with professionals in the comics trade, anywhere from Joe Kubert, Robert Koniger, Rick Veach, John Tuttleben, Alan Moore, and an early stint with R.L. Stine. He has also owned his own publishing company, Spider Baby Graphics, and one of his accomplishments in India publishing is his piece on the Tyrannosaurus Rex tyrant, and he's going to be doing some lecturing, he told us recently, on the changing views of reptology with like dinosaurs. So he's a very accomplished speaker, he's a very accomplished artist, he's an accomplished publisher, and we are so happy to have him here with us. So without further ado, Stephen, we'll turn it over to you.
Hello, one and all, and thanks for inviting me in, and thanks for having me. Please forgive the eye contact issue that may creep up at times, because to see you, I've got to look down at the screen, which means I won't be looking at the little green dot. Thanks for inviting me in. My name's Steve Bissette, born, raised, still living in Vermont. Have been working in the comic book industry and graphic novel industry in various ways since 1976. And still at it. I retired from teaching. As John mentioned, I had taught for 15 years at the Center for Cartoon Studies in White River Junction, Vermont, a college level graphic novel 2-year program, which put me on the other end of the classroom from Joe Kubert, my hero and mentor. And I was a member of the first ever graduating class of the Joe Kubert School in Cartoon and Graphic Art. And that was in 1978. I'm here to talk about reanimation as it applies to a body of work I had a hand in, the saga of the Swamp Thing. I will open by sharing a reanimator story with you all. One of the times that John Tollivan and I were delivering original art, an issue that we were working on, to our editor, Karen Berger, at the DC offices at the building that was called The Beast because it was at 666 Rockefeller Plaza in New York City. Karen invited John and I to pick any film we wanted to see that afternoon, and she would treat us. John is from and still lives in Erie, Pennsylvania. At that time, I was living in Wilmington, Vermont, and there was a brand new horror film that was playing nowhere near John and I, and that was Stuart Gordon's Reanimator. So without missing a beat, probably in the same breath, John and I both went, Reanimator! And Karen Berger, the founder of Vertigo, took us to Reanimator, and the film almost made Karen sick to her stomach. While John Tollivan and I laughed our asses off, not because we're sadists, but because it's an amazing horror movie. So there was already a reanimation aspect, you know, integral to the work we were doing on Swamp Thing, and it was manifest that afternoon at a matinee in New York. Okay, without further ado, I am going to jump into an illustrated lecture. I'm going to be hitting a lot of beats here because the theme of reanimation and Swamp Thing has many, many, many ties: scientific, cultural, historical, aesthetic, and the nature of creative chemistry with teams of creators working on a commercial, periodical, serialized comic adventure. So here we go. This will take me just a moment to bring up. Share. Slideshow. Here we go. Okay. Let's get into this. Now, I'm going to have to necessarily cover a little bit of history here. Some of this is familiar to a number of you, but some of this will be completely new to those of you who are not grounded in the more archaic aspects of 20th century comic book history. That aspect of it will be a theme that I'll be returning to a couple of times during this afternoon's get together, where I'll be talking about the Comics Code Authority and how it was that we had a hand in transforming the nature of the comic book and at that time nascent graphic novel industry by losing the Comics Code seal of approval on one issue of Swamp Thing. The Comics Code Authority doesn't exist anymore, I'm very happy to say. The Comics Code Authority was an industry-run, self-regulatory censorship body. It was initiated in late 1954, and the Comics Code Authority offices closed up shop in 2011, and much to the regret of archivists, librarians, historians, researchers, and fans, apparently all their records were disposed of before anyone had an opportunity to lay hands on whatever records may have remained at the CCA. There's also an aspect of reanimation in Swamp Thing that ties into the very curious science of planaria worms. In fact, early in our run, the first issue that Alan Moore scripted, that John Tollivan, myself, and Rick Veach penciled, inked, and worked together as a team, Alan introduced the idea of regeneration in planarian worms being a metaphor for why Swamp Thing became Swamp Thing. And in doing so, Alan not only resurrected, reanimated a comics character that had been through a number of deaths and resurrections, Alan also reinterpreted the origins of Swamp Thing with this metaphor. And I will get more explicit with that when we get to that part of this story I'm telling you this afternoon. Okay, so I'll head off by pointing out to you, this is the issue that lost the Comics Code authority. Saga of the Swamp Thing, number 29, cover dated October 1984. We couldn't have made that happen, and it is so perfect that the very year that my generation associated with, you know, an authoritarian overlord in government, that we overthrew the Comics Code in the October issue, the Halloween issue, if you will. Bear in mind that cover dates on comics and magazines do not refer to the date that they were printed or published. It refers to the date that they were supposed to be pulled off the stands. So that means this issue of Swamp Thing was actually in shops and on newsstands late summer, at the latest early fall of 1984. It went out without the Comics Code seal of approval because there was no time to change the contents of the issue when the code flagged the issue as being problematic, and I will get into what it was they flagged. And it didn't kill us. In fact, the sales began to take off with the book, due in no small part to the considerable support that we already had earned from the direct sale comic retailer community. Let me talk a little bit about what was going on at that time in comics, just so that you understand that we were not the only player involved in this push me, pull you tug of war with the code in the early and mid 80s. DC Comics had already launched their first direct market only title. And when I refer to direct market, there's two ways that comic books were being sold by the early 1980s. There was newsstand distribution, the traditional mode of comic book distribution, which had been the primary means of publishing, distributing, and selling comic books from 1938 up to this time. But it also refers to a secondary market, which became the primary market, and that was the direct sale market, which meant direct sale referred to distribution where the distributors were buying the issues direct from the publisher, from DC Comics in this case. And this meant that the product was non-returnable. Newsstand distribution is a very wasteful form of distribution. You know, to sell 100,000 copies of something, publishers typically print and distribute 200,000 copies of something. And it's very unusual when a magazine or comic book or book has a complete sell-through where every copy sells out. The direct sale market was a revolution in the 70s that occurred thanks to a retailer named Phil Suling, who first approached Marvel and DC Comics with the idea of buying direct from them. And by the time we were involved with Swamp Thing, the direct sale market had been up and running for a little bit shy of a decade, and really had come into its own right around the end of the 70s, 77, 78, 79. So DC published a book called Camelot 3000. It was their first mini-series designed to be sold only in the direct sale market, meaning it was not submitted to the Comics Code. They also had a mini-series called Gem, Son of Saturn, and Gem lost the code seal of approval for this issue, Gem number 3, because of a character who was a drug dealer and references to drug dealing and drug use, and that was forbidden at the time by the code. There was also one artist I need to mention, particularly in the context of Alan Moore, because right now Kevin O'Neill is one of the few artists still doing new work with Kevin. They just wrapped up their very long-lasting and very highly recommended League of Extraordinary Gentlemen series of graphic novels. Kevin O'Neill was the only cartoonist I know of who was banned by the code. They didn't use the word ban. What they began doing is they refused every story that Kevin O'Neill drew. They had no rational reason. They were refusing Kevin's work because they found his style of drawing inherently problematic and antithetical to the code's reign. And I think this puts Kevin O'Neill in a particular throne of honor in this narrative of the battle with the Comics Code. By the way, the story that Kevin O'Neill drew that was refused by the code was scripted by his friend Alan Moore. By 1987, this was about 3 to 4 years after Alan had come on the book. The work that we had done on Swamp Thing was already beginning to make its way out of the comic book marketplace and the direct sale market and into bookstores. In fact, in 1987, these simultaneously published book collections of our early issues of Saga of the Swamp Thing were the initial graphic novel repackaging of our work on Saga of the Swamp Thing. The cover on the left is the DC edition of Saga of the Swamp Thing, using for its cover a painting that John Totleben had done as a benefit item for an auction at the Mid-Ohio Comic Convention to benefit the American Cancer Society. And the cover on the right was the Warner Books edition that went into bookstores and into libraries and the bookstore market. And for most readers these days, these might have been their first introduction to the work we had been doing as serialized comic books, what my students called floppies, which is a term that has other connotations for my generation. Our work is still in print around the world, and I'm just pointing it out to you. I'm not bragging. It's very satisfying that the work didn't just disappear. Very gratifying. And I'm also happy to tell you, in case this is a point of concern, yes, we are paid royalties every quarter from the sales of the work. We did not create Swamp Thing. Alan Moore, John Totleben, Rick Veitch, Steve Bissette, we do not get creator royalties on Swamp Thing. We get royalties for the reprints of the work that we created for the comic book. Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson were the creators of Swamp Thing. I still love drawing the character. Here's a couple of examples of the kind of sketch art that I still do for fans. If you're one of the folks out there waiting for a sketch that I owe you, they will be coming. This winter, I've done probably around 100 new Swamp Thing sketches that I'll be mailing out this spring to fans that purchase them. Okay, where did the code come from? I'm going to keep this real short. Why did the code exist? This is the kind of comic book cover from EC Comics that most people who have any interest in the code or the horror comics controversy in the early 50s think of when they think of where the code came from. But really, it came about because the comic book industry was and is just that. It's a business. It's an industry. And a dilemma presented itself by the early 1950s. And that dilemma was this. Starting in 1948, romance comics became #1 sellers. And the best-selling romance comics tended to be more adult in nature. In fact, more adult in nature than a lot of contemporary 21st century readers might consider even possible at that time. And by 1952 to 54, there was a huge boom in crime and horror comics. And as I say, this was a business. This means that crime and horror comics were big business. EC Comics is the company that's still remembered for their affiliation and leading of the horror field at that time, with titles like Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and so on. But every comic publisher was experimenting with the horror genre. There were very few exceptions. Very few publishers that were not trying to put out one-shot or periodical horror comics at the time. And in any period of tight competition and rapid generation of new material, the ante raised very quickly, and the imagery got more and more and more graphic and more and more and more sensationalistic. By the way, this is one of my favorite covers on the right from a pre-code crime comic that edges into horror with its depiction of what's going on with this particular crime. Don't strain your eyes. It says, "I know you're a mute, Miss Kimberly, but even if you could yell, the people downstairs couldn't call the police. You see, I already cut all their tongues out." And those are the tongues spilling onto the floor. You can imagine what a 1953 parent who might have deigned to look at what their son or daughter was bringing home from the newsstand, how they might react if they actually took the moment to look at and then read that balloon on that cover. By April of 1954, this controversy metastasized when Dr. Frederick Wortham, a very progressive and politically progressive man, issued his best-selling book, Seduction of the Innocent. What actually brought the controversy to a head wasn't just the release of the book, but that it had also been excerpted and synopsized in very popular magazine like the Ladies' Home Journal. And the US Senate subcommittee hearings were underway. Initially, the Senate subcommittee hearings were involved in investigating interstate crime. That led to an investigation of interstate distribution of problematic literature, and that quickly led to the US Senate subcommittee investigating the crime in the horror comics. In the fall and winter of 1954, the publishers were sufficiently freaked out by what had been happening, and particularly by the television broadcast in spring of 54 of some of those Senate subcommittee hearings involving the comic book industry, and they formed a self-regulatory body called the Comics Code Authority. It was launched at the end of 54, and this code seal of approval began to appear on comic books by the beginning of 1955. And it was an industry self-regulatory body, but it was also a collusion between publishers, distributors, and even printers. If the code had not approved individual pages of comic art, the stamp would appear on the front and on the back of the original art. The issue would not be printed. If the code seal of approval was not visible on the front of the book, the comic book would not be distributed. The wire bound copies would be held in the distribution warehouses and returned to the publishers. There were two exceptions to this. There were two publishers who never signed on with the code and still maintained visibility and considerable success in the comic book marketplace. And that was Gilberton, the publisher of Classics Illustrated, and Dell Comics, who had their own distribution and printing network, and by this time had sold the public that Dell Comics were good comics. And indeed, the only reaction Dell had to the Comics Code seal of approval appearing on all the other publishers' comics was to expand the size of their Dell seal, almost to emulate the look of the CCA seal. It was promoted to the public very aggressively. There were articles in newspapers, magazines. This kind of stand or banner would appear in shop windows of local pharmacies, tobacco shops, any place that was selling comic books. And this remained the status quo until roughly 1969, when Stan Lee was approached by the US government, who was getting frustrated with the fact that they could not successfully peddle anti-drug propaganda to the generation, hey, I was part of. Okay, I was born in 1955, so I was in high school in 1969. We laughed at the kind of anti-drug films that were being shown to us in home economic classes, or in my case as a male, shop class. So the government approached Marvel Comics and asked Stan Lee to do an anti-drug issue of Spider-Man. And in fact, it turned out to be a 3-part narrative that was originally published in The Amazing Spider-Man number 96, 97, and 98. And these were all published without the code seal of approval, because when Marvel submitted the issues to the code said, no. You cannot depict drug use in any way, shape, or form. And Marvel said, but the FDA asked us to. And Marvel took the extraordinary step of the time of putting these books without the code seal. They were still sold on newsstands, and they got nothing but remarkable positive press, including articles in major newspapers, magazines like Time and Newsweek, and so on. So the fact that these issues were a success without the code seal of approval prompted the code to take a hard look at changing their regulations, updating them. By the way, DC Comics often touts their Green Lantern, Green Arrow drug abuse issues, the ones in which Green Arrow finds out his sidekick Speedy is hooked on something or other. It's never clear in comics what the drugs actually are or do. They were published after the code revision I'm about to bring to your attention. So May of 1971 is when the Comics Code Authority revised and released the revised code. And there was a booklet that was distributed to everyone in the industry and to news vendors and anyone involved in handling comic book retail and sales at this time. And in there, they revised a portion of the code that led directly to the creation of the character of Swamp Thing. So this is Reanimation number 1, if you're paying attention to the reanimation aspect of this talk now. The original code in 1954 in General Standards Part B had a section in which they made it clear that certain aspects of the horror comics would no longer be permitted. And if you want to take a moment, I won't read you this entire code piece. Scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirism, ghouls, cannibalism, and my favorite word in the entire code, werewolfism, are prohibited. So monsters, by and large, particularly the classic monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy, were no longer permitted in code-approved comics. This neutered the genre, as you can well imagine. With the revision of the code in 1969, they changed that portion of the code. Here's the rewritten code circa 1971, scanned directly from the copy in my collection. And you'll now note that scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead or torture shall not be used. Vampires, ghouls, and werewolves shall be permitted to be used when handled in the classic tradition, such as Frankenstein, Dracula, and other high caliber literary works. Written by Edgar Allan Poe, Saki, parentheses, H.H. Munro, close parentheses, Conan Doyle, and other respected authors whose works are read in schools throughout the world. This meant that up at DC Comics, one of the former EC Comics artists, Joe Orlando, who had since moved from making his living primarily as a freelance artist to also working as an editor at DC Comics, Joe Orlando oversaw an overhaul of two of DC's so-called mystery titles, quote unquote. And the House of Secrets and the House of Mystery went from being these sort of bland, sometimes interesting fantasy, science fiction, fantasy comics to once again becoming horror comics. And in House of Secrets number 92, in July of 1971, the cover story, a one-shot self-standing story called Swamp Thing, was first published. By the way, that is the great Louise Simonson on the cover. She posed for Bernie Wrightson when he did this cover. And in the story Swamp Thing, written by Len Wein, art by Bernie Wrightson, it's their friends who play the various characters in the story. That's Mike Kaluta as the evil romantic interloper who ends up destroying the young man whose future is terminated when he is killed and his body is thrown into the swamp, and he is reanimated as the titular Swamp Thing. This story got a tremendous reader reaction. The results of sales were very slow to record. Dick Giordano once explained to us that it took over 6 months to get sales, accurate sales records on newsstand comics. It took that long for them to go out, be racked, have their sales window, be returned to distributors, and the results tallied. But editors at DC, and particularly editors like Joe Orlando, were very quick to respond when readers' letters would begin pouring in. And in fact, this one-shot story, Swamp Thing, won the Comic Book Academy Award that year as best story. Yes, there were Comic Book Academy Awards in 1971. This led to Joe Orlando convincing Len Wein and Bernie Wrightson to collaborate anew on an ongoing series called Swamp Thing. And the first issue of the series Swamp Thing was launched with a cover date of November 1972, meaning it was actually on the stands by September, October. And Len and Bernie's run lasted 10 issues. The run on Swamp Thing outlasted Len and Bernie. Bernie became very frustrated with working exclusively on this periodical. And I have to tell you, as a freelancer who worked on monthly deadlines during my time on Saga of the Swamp Thing, it's hard going. One of the professors here, Stephen Albee Scott, I believe, said that his goal was to be a graphic novelist, and he quickly decided that it was too heavy a workload. Well, Stephen, you may have made the right choice, because it is indeed tough to tackle ongoing chores on a monthly book, or a bi-monthly book in this case. By the way, at the same time, Len Wein and the writer Jerry Conway were roommates in New York City. Len and Jerry were both doing work for DC and Marvel at the time. And they each created their own swamp monster around the same time. Len Wein wrote and co-created Swamp Thing. Jerry Conway wrote and co-created Man-Thing. The two were launched the same year, and yet there was never any litigation between the publishers over these swamp monsters. Apparently, it was just a situation that Marvel and DC, or DC and Marvel, tolerated. And I always wondered if the fact that Len and Jerry were living together at the time as roommates had anything to do with that. By the way, this is one of my sketches of the Bosom Bayou Buddies. The series Swamp Thing ended with the 24th issue. As I mentioned, Bernie had moved on after finishing issue 10's art job. Here is the unpublished cover art for what would have been Swamp Thing number 25. And as you can see, by the 24th and 25th issue, they had wandered quite afield from it being a monster / horror comic. And typical of comic book publishers of the 70s, it was thought, oh, if sales are flagging, let's start throwing superhero characters into the book. The character of Swamp Thing was so moribund by the end of the 1970s that, as Paul Levitz once described it to me on the phone, DC made the worst licensing deal the company had ever made. They licensed Swamp Thing, lock, stock, and barrel to the production team of Benjamin Melniker and Michael Uslan. This meant that DC only retained the rights to publish a comic book called Swamp Thing, or a variation on a comic called Swamp Thing. All other rights, including merchandising, belonged to Melniker and Uslan. And in 1981, Wes Craven's very low budget Swamp Thing movie hit theaters. It was not a success. It bombed when it came out. It bombed not because of the quality of the film per se, but because the distributor, Avco Embassy, who in 1980 had a huge hit by releasing a string of independently produced horror and genre films, including The Howling, David Cronenberg's Scanners, John Carpenter's Escape from New York. There was new management in charge of Avco Embassy by 1981. One of those new owners was Norman Lear, co-creator of All in the Family, the very popular 70s TV show. And Norman Lear and the new owners hated horror movies. So they essentially buried Swamp Thing. I was eager to see it at the time, and it played for 3 days in our local theater in Brattleboro, Vermont, the now long gone Paramount Theater in downtown Brattleboro. So this movie was just dumped. But DC Comics had seized on the fact that the film was coming out, and they revived the Swamp Thing character in a new comic book series. This is Swamp Thing Annual #1. This came out in 1981, featuring the poster art from the film. And even though the movie had bombed in theaters, it was quickly sold off to cable television right at the time when cable programming for outfits like HBO were hungry for recent movie product. Some of you may remember when HBO launched, and I remember I had friends who thought HBO meant, hey, Beastmaster's on, because films like Beastmaster and Swamp Thing were shown so frequently on cable, multiple times per day, that Swamp Thing became kind of a cult movie thanks to cable. A TV series was launched soon after, not on network television. It was, again, a cable TV series. And theatrical revivals of the Wes Craven film began to pop up, including, let's talk about the opposite of Reanimation, including the late belated Alamo Theater chain. This is the poster that was designed by the Alamo folks for one of their theater revivals of the Wes Craven Swamp Thing. All of this activity meant there was even a sequel for Swamp Thing, the movie. Jim Warnowski's Return of the Swamp Thing, which was released briefly in 1989 to theaters and then dumped onto cable and also direct to video. Saga the Swamp Thing, however, as a comic book series, was officially relaunched with a May 1982 issue, meaning it was on sale late winter, early spring. The writer was Marty Pasco, who sadly just passed away early in 2020. And the art was by one of my Kubert School classmates, Tom Yates. And Tom Yates right now is the artist on Prince Valiant, the Prince Valiant Sunday pages that he works on collaboratively with writer Mark Schultz, the creator of Xenozoic Tales, aka Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. So the new series was launched in May of '82. Tom Yates did his best to stay on top of the deadlines, but the book began behind schedule because of scheduling difficulties. Tom was immediately drafting some of his old Hubert School classmates to help him out whenever possible. And this meant that starting with the saga of the Swamp Thing #2, our classmates John Totleben and Rick Veitch were going down to Hopatcong, New Jersey, where Tom Yates was living and had his studio, to pitch in and help Tom with Swamp Thing. Totlben's art assists begin with the second issue. If you're a Totleben fan, get your hands on either the reprint editions that recently came out of Marty Pasco and Tom Yates' run. I started pitching in on layouts and art assists with #8, and that's the cover to #8 on the right. This meant that when Tom Yates decided he had had enough, like Bernie Wrightson, Tom was feeling very constrained with just staying on top of these monthly deadlines. And all of us as creators get hungry at a certain point for doing something different, you know? And Tom let John and I know we should audition for the book. And in a fateful weekend in New Jersey, where we were designing Dungeon and Dragon toys, under the stewardship of another of our classmates, Tim Truman, creator of Scout, among other characters. John and I would work for Tim Truman during the day on the Dungeon and Dragon toy designs, and at 5 o'clock we'd have dinner, and then we would work on our sample pages in the evening. And when the week was out, we delivered our sample pages to Tom Yates, who brought them up to Len Wein at DC offices. And despite the fact other artists were also competing for that gig, Len decided we were the team. By the way, John and I did 2 sets of samples. We did a set of samples where John penciled and I inked, and we did another set of samples where I penciled and John inked. And Len was the one who looked at our work and went, okay, Steve's got the stronger storytelling and page design chops. John's got the more seductive ink line. That's how the team's going to work. Steve, you're penciling. John, you're inking. And indeed, as of the August 1983 issue, Swamp Thing #16, that was how we began. So here we are reanimating a character who had already been reanimated twice, okay? Swamp Thing died at the end of the 70s, reanimated by the Wes Craven film that bombed, reanimated by cable TV, then reanimated by DC Comics to become a new series, and then starting with issue #16, John and I had our own ideas for the character, particularly John Totleben. The big learning curve for me was I had been working professionally in comics by this time for, about 7 or 8 years. I now had to teach myself not to do the entire job on a comic page. I had to teach myself to just pencil. And here's a sample of my pencils for the last issue that we did with Marty Pasco as writer, Swamp Thing #19. However, John Totleben had been a classmate at the Hubert School, and John and I, as I did with Rick Veitch, as I did with Tom Yates and other classmates, we jammed a lot. And I knew John's strengths and weaknesses. John knew my strengths and weaknesses. So when I would pencil a page, I would go tight with the aspects of the storytelling and specifically the rendering that I felt, that I had to make sure I put down what was in my head, what I was visualizing. But I could go loose with other aspects of the pencils where I knew John was going to do whatever he wanted to do anyway. Alan Moore was brought on as writer. I won't go into all the details with Saga of the Swamp Thing #20. This was the issue that was on sale January of 1984. So the work was done at the end of '83, summer, fall of '83, and in sales racks by the end of 1983. And Alan Moore was brought on because Marty Pasco was also moving on to greener pastures. Marty was doing much better with the more lucrative paying work, writing scripts for Saturday morning animated cartoons, which was a huge industry still at that time. So Len Wein reached out to this British writer that nobody in America had heard of, named Alan Moore. And when Len Wein called myself up and then called John Totleben up, he was very disappointed to find out that we already knew Alan's work. John and I had been buying issues of Warrior magazine at local American comic shops that were carrying the British magazine Warrior. And we loved the work that Alan Moore had been doing collaboratively on Marvel Man and V for Vendetta. So we were overjoyed when we found out Alan Moore was going to be on our book. The first issue that we all did together, the first Alan Moore, Bissette, Toddleben with Rick Beach team issue, is this one, Swamp Thing 21. This issue was penciled by Canadian Dan Day, brother of Gene Day. It was being penciled by Dan Day because I was finishing pencils on number 19, getting script pages phoned to me by Marty Pasco. That's how far behind schedule we were at this point. At the same time that John Toddleben was inking Dan Day's pencils from Alan Moore's first script for Len Wein. You got that? So the first issue we actually got to work on as a team was the anatomy lesson, Swamp Thing 21. And this is the point where, relevant to the theme of this series of events and lectures, comes to the fore once again, which is reanimation. It's very curious to all of us at the time. Alan Moore, John Toddleben, and I immediately began swapping very long letters. This is before internet. There was no email. The only ways of communicating for a group that were stationed in Northampton, England, where Alan Moore lived, Erie, Pennsylvania, where John Toddleben lived, Wilmington, Vermont, where Steve Bissette lived, was to use the mail, the US mail. And in the first exchange of letters, we found we all wanted to do the same thing with Swamp Thing. We were tired of the, oh, poor me, muckman Swamp Thing, the man trapped in the body of the monster, the constant repetition of the narrative device of how can Alec Holland turn back into his human self, right? We were tired of that. We wanted Swamp Thing to be a plant elemental. And it turned out all three of us were on the same page. So this was an idea that had been pitched to Len Wein early on in the Saga of the Swamp Thing run, when Tom Yates brought in one of John Toddleben's drawing of a mossy, overgrown Swamp Thing. And Len Wein nixed that approach, saying it was too radical. Well, once there was a new writer on board, particularly a writer that Len Wein had great affection and respect for, once Alan Moore pitched the idea, Len let us run with it. And if you've never read the anatomy lesson, which is that first story we did together, this is where Alan laid out and formalized all the ideas that Alan, John Toddleben, and I had been carrying for some time, particularly John Toddleben. Out of the three of us, out of the four of us, when I count Rick Beach, John Toddleben was the only one of us who was really a diehard fan of Swamp Thing, the character, and of Bernie Wrightson's work in particular. And John had long talked about the problem with the character being that human incarnation being the constant, never to be arrived at destination point, and wanted to just turn it into an incarnation of the classical Green Man, folkloric and mythic archetype. What Alan pitched and put into the script of that issue was the idea of the regeneration as it is found in nature with the planarian worm, that if you cut a planarian worm into pieces, each piece will grow into a replica of itself. And Alan's idea, which is presented in that issue on this very page, I won't leave this up long enough for you to read the page completely, but here's your reference point after the talk if you want to revisit the issue, is Alan lays out that Alec Holland died before his body fell into the swamp. He was already dead, not coming back. That the method of reanimation was not the reanimation of the dead in the way that it is popularly presented in zombie films and zombie literature and so on, but rather that the plant life that absorbed what was left of the consciousness of Alec Holland at the point of dying, reconstituted his form and created as close a replica as it could of the dying being who had fallen into this swamp. The reason, of course, for the reanimation / resurrection is because his body had been saturated with this remarkable new chemical that Alec Holland had developed in his lab. And that aspect of the origin remains just as it was in 1971. But what Alan did was remove the whole resurrection, reanimation of the dead aspect and present Swamp Thing as a new being, a brand new creature altogether. In serialized comics,
Steve.
yes, go ahead.
Hey,
I'm sorry.
Hey, no, I just don't. I just want to jump in and say, can you just flip back to that last page real quick?
We're there.
I noticed, yeah, when you guys started working together, I'm wondering what element of the layout is what you and John came up with versus what Alan dictated, because I know Alan's scripts are wildly descriptive and detailed. So
how are we doing on time, by the way, before I get into it?
we are 1:51. We're doing pretty good.
Oh, good. 1 minute and 51 seconds.
No,
Wow,
no,
I
it's-
covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, I know
Okay.
that's
Okay, good.
No, 1:51.
Okay, well, stay with me because I'm actually going to walk you through a page of script pencils, right? I'll show you the whole process, right?
Cool.
The layouts are mine.
Gotcha.
Alan Moore would send us scripts. His scripts were very detailed, as you mentioned, John, but the layout was entirely up to me. The penciler in this production chain that periodical comics used to be produced through, it's a bit like assembling a car, okay? And my job was to build the chassis and the frame. Alan was designing the vehicle, giving it a name. I could not deviate at all from his text, and there was no point in time where I would have anyway, because I'd been working in the field long enough that I knew that wasn't my job. My job was to adhere to Alan's script, but not necessarily to adhere to his art direction or his page direction. In fact, for those of you who have read enough of Alan's work that you know Watchmen, his collaboration with Dave Gibbons, Alan often relied on a traditional grid, 6-panel grid, 9-panel grid. I was at an aesthetic point in my development as an artist where I hated this rectangle. I loathed this rectangle of the comic page. And my modus operandi was to smash the grid. And that passion on my part fit like a glove with the modus operandi of the genre we were working in. Horror comics and monster comics are supposed to unsettle and disturb the reader. We are not doing Saga of the Swamp Thing to comfort and lull our readers' sensibilities. And I, in particular, out of the team, was the one that was really on board with Alan in terms of let's push this envelope as far as we can. John Tolliban and Rick Veitch were right there as well. But my frustration with the comic page, with the rectangle, with the grid, was probably unique among the team members. So I would lay out the pages from Alan's script, but I, while adhering to all his directions, would do everything I could to, in this case, melt and transmute the page design. Alan had called for, you're looking at a 7-panel page here. And rather than working with linear drawn panel borders, you can see that as soon as we are in Alec Holland's head at the point of death, falling into the swamp, I dissolve traditional panel borders altogether. It was also my job to place the text, okay? Because I'm working from full script. I got to place the text, and John Costanzo, the letterer, had a very distinctive lettering style, and I would pencil in the lettering because I knew the exact size and precision of Costanzo's style, and he never complained about that. He actually once told Karen Berger that he was happy that I did that job for him, because a lot of pencilers would turn in work and it was up to the letterer and editor to place balloons and panels. To me, leading your eye through this page, and as you can see, it's an S configuration that I lead your eye through, and everything about panels 4, 5, 6, and 7 is leading your eye using the placement of the text to get your eye to where I want you looking. I'll come back to that question, John, in more detail when I get to that point. I'm actually going to show you Alan's scripts for a specific page and then what I did with it. 3 issues later, we finally have Swamp Thing wake up. He's essentially goes into a coma at the end of issue 21, and is not resurrected until issue 23. And this is the splash page where Swamp Thing reawakens, and he is now fully cognizant of he's not Alec Holland. He was never Alec Holland. He is a plant creature. And this meant that he now has abilities that had never been part of the character. And this is how we not only reanimated the character, but transformed the character. A few other aspects I want to touch on. Starting with issue 24, I was also helping lay out covers. Traditionally, at companies like Marvel and DC, if an artist is leaving the book, in this case, Tom Yates, the editor will keep that artist on the book doing covers, so there's visual continuity for readers, so that the comic still looks like the comic they had been reading before the key artist left the book. And by issue 24, Tom Yates would call me and say, Steve, you got any ideas for the cover? And what you're seeing on the left is what's left of a sheet of vellum where I thumbnailed a few cover ideas, and that's my cover rough. And then you see on the right, Tom Yates's final version of the cover. And you can see what he stuck with, what he deviated from, and so on. We also saw our reanimation of Swamp Thing, not only changing it from a superhero comic in the DC universe to a horror comic, we also saw it as a transformation into a romance comic. We wanted to get into the nature of this bizarre relationship between a human woman, Abby Cable, and this plant man, Swamp Thing. She's in love with a sentient potato. And we really wanted to get into that. We saw rich story possibilities here. Once we lost the code, we were able to pursue them quite aggressively. This is the double page spread from the Crisis on Infinite Earth crossover issue, Swamp Thing 46. And I'm showing it to you. Yes, I penciled it. Yes, John Toddleman inked it. This was also the point where I disengaged emotionally from the work we were doing. This is the point where suddenly we had to stop everything we were doing on Swamp Thing and do a crisis issue that brought in all these DC characters that had nothing to do what we were doing. And I suppose much like Bernie Wrightson prior to the original Swamp Thing number 10, and much like my friend Tom Yates prior to his leaving the book around issue 12 of Saga of the Swamp Thing, I was not only ready to move on to other projects if I could find them, I also was getting quite exasperated with the introduction of more and more and more DC superhero characters and past characters to the book. I was so disgusted with it that, in fact, Len Wein and Alan Moore staged a little bit of a grift on me. I was told that it was Len Wein that was insisting on introducing these characters to the book. And it was only a little later that Alan admitted, no, really, Steve, it was me. I wanted to bring him into the book. But Len was willing to go with that because he wanted to keep us together as a team. And the same goes once Karen Berger took over editing the book with issue 25. Okay, John, let me now answer your question in a little more detail. So when I'm penciling a page, here's Swamp Thing 25, a page that shows Matt Cable alone in the apartment he shares with Abby. And one of his first manifestations of telekinetic abilities. This is another form of reanimation, and the reason I decided to bring this into the conversation here. You can see that Alan called for a 6-panel grid, okay? However, while obeying his call for a 6-panel grid, look at the subtle changes that I made, all right? Every aspect of designing a page, a panel, the placement of the balloons, the placement of the captions is a tool in the storyteller's toolkit. Even the way the panel borders are drawn is a tool in that toolkit, okay? So this is a very creepy, disturbing scene. So I wanted to open up that last shot that Alan called for of Matt Cable sitting in his chair with these bizarre creatures that he's materializing out of his mind around him. So I subtly shrink the sizing of the top and second tier to give me a little more breathing room at the bottom of the page within the trim lines where the page will be cut, so that the final caption, instead of encroaching on this majestic image Alan called for of Matt Cable sitting there surrounded by creatures on his, comfy chair throne, I gave more space to that panel just by shrinking slightly the size of the top two tiers. Also note the panel borders. Panel 1 and 2 are ruled. I drew them with a ruler. Panel 3 is hand drawn because we're getting into the disturbing aspects of Matt Cable's interior state of psychosis. And the panel borders for 3, 4, and 5 are not only hand drawn, but as we move through the panels, I'm drawing those panel borders rougher and rougher. In fact, panel 5 is drawn with the side of my pencil. These are invisible, unconscious, unlikely to even be noticed cues to the readers of this that things are amiss here. This is a dark, psychotic space we are entering with this character. And I use every component of designing this page to communicate that. Alan didn't call for it. That was my understanding what was possible with the page design. And I was doing it to follow Alan's directions of making this a disturbing sequence. Yes, I heard.
Well, no, I love that, because the reason I asked is one of the things that really got me into this book is all the side adornments. And for me, those cues, those visual cues were so different from what I had seen before. I was like, whoa. And I always loved the side adornments in some of the issues. And that's why I really asked, because I always know that when I've read about Alan Moore's instructions, they're extremely tight. And I read some of Eddie Campbell's commentary on Stuff and From Hell, like where it just go like, well, he had a good idea, but then the bridge didn't exist.
Well, sure. But there's also a difference between slavishly following the instructions from a writer on a script and doing what Alan always invited. Almost at the end of every page, Alan would say, unless you've got a better idea, in which case go with it, right? Some variation on that.
It's beautiful, man.
I always took it as license to, I'm going to push this as far as I can go. I wanted this to be as creepy a sequence as I could make it in a single page. And it's also the culmination of a character buildup that had been coming from before Alan was even writing the book. So I was also seeing these kind of beats, these kind of moments, as having a place in a much larger continuity that we were working within. And any regular reader would get that. They'd feel it. And if this was the first issue you ever read, you'd still feel it. All right. Also note, by doing things which have always been done in the comic book field and the comic strip field, by leaving out the border, you can see my little instruction on the right of the page, no border. Leaving the border off a panel opens that panel up. It makes it suddenly the backdrop for the entire page, right? Very simple devices like, very simple devices like this have an enormous storytelling potential and impact. So this is the issue that we lost the code. I promised you all I'd tell you why. Well, we lost the code because the issue 29 involves Abby starting in her apartment completely freaked out. Here's another example. This is the first page of Swamp Thing 29, the issue that lost the code. Again, Alan called for a 6-panel grid. Now, this is where the difference between how writers think and address the medium and how artists think comes to the fore. Alan set up a sequence where we don't see Abby until the last panel on the page, and we could only see her a little bit in the background. But what Alan wanted was that this wire brush in the foreground of panel 6 had dewdrops of blood on it. She had been scrubbing her skin with a wire brush. Now, if I stuck with a 6-panel grid, as Alan described it, that brush would be very tiny. It would not have the dramatic weight of shifting the 2-panel tiers up and expanding the scope on the page so that panel 6 is actually the largest panel on the page without disrupting the grid. And it allowed me to push that brush right in the foreground and make it, in fact, the largest object on the page, which is honoring the directions from Alan Moore. It's not, undercutting them or subverting them. Also note This is, this is not a happy sequence. We're looking at the residue and apartment of somebody essentially having a complete nervous breakdown. Bottles are broken, matches have been lit, clothing is smoking and doused with cleaning chemicals. And as we move into the kitchen, we see Abby passed out on the floor, and there's blood on the floor. By the way, notice Tatiana Wood, one of the great colorists in the comic book industry, we weren't allowed to have blood be truly YR red, the brightest red. Tatiana would always have to soften it a bit because the code didn't allow blood to be prominent in any comics at the time. One of the reasons we got away with the monster violence that we did is Swamp Thing bled green. So we could go right to town with that, right? So I also didn't just shrink the two tiers, I tilt them because I want to pull your eye down with a diagonal to point right at Abby's head with the slant of panels 4 and 5. But also by putting these at a slight diagonal, I am making the reader uneasy from page 1. I don't want you comfortably in a 6-panel grid. 6-panel grids are stable. 6-panel grids have the illusion of security and stability. I am fighting that with every fiber of my being. And with my pencils, I use the side of my pencil in the final panel to create sort of an arc coming down to Abby. And I did that knowing that John would do just what he did. He would turn that into a beautiful brush and ink texture that also pulls your eye down through the cabinetry down to Abby, the point of this page. Also, putting Abby at the far bottom right-hand corner invites you to turn the page. Okay, so before we turn the page, let's look at what Alan Moore instructed me to do. Here is a scan from Alan Moore's script. Page 2, full page splash here. So Alan's calling for a full page splash on page 2, which is what? A vertical triangle, rectangle, I'm sorry. That's what Alan's calling for. Showing a sort of symbolic fantasy image of Abby's unconscious mind. Somewhere in the middle, Abby floats, naked and in the same fetal posture, her white hair drifting out around her and a thin line of blood trickling from the scrubbed patch on her shoulder. All around her are images of filthy, disgusting, bug-infested evil. I won't describe it any more fully than that, except to note that I see the coloring of the bug imagery as being composed more or less of browns and rusts and sepias and yellows. Alan is introducing right on page 2 the insect imagery, because this entire story of reanimation in Swamp Thing 29 hinges on insects are the vehicle of reanimation for the dead. Okay? Bugs are inside the zombies, and it's the insects that the villainous character Arcane is using down in hell to manipulate and resurrect the bodies of the dead. So I'll leave this up just a moment so you can drink it in. So Alan is calling for a full page splash, a single panel. Then on page, this is page 2. Other than that, draw it as you will. I would not presume for one moment to instruct 2 modern masters of filthy, disgusting, bug-infested evil, such as yourselves, upon the fine details of a scene like this. Then Alan notes an Art Spiegelman strip in Arcade, one of the great last underground publications. Arcade lasted, I think, about 10 issues. And there was a strip by Art Spiegelman where he's moving into an apartment in New York, and it's infested with cockroaches, and Art drew cockroaches all over the page into the bleed off area. And Alan refers to that. I knew that story. I knew exactly what he was talking about. And then Alan brings in the only caption on this splash page. She could smell it in her dreams. Now, it's very important what Alan's doing here. Alan is now on the first and second page of this story, evoking the reader's sense of smell. This is why Alan Moore is such a great comics writer. He doesn't just engage your eyes. He doesn't just engage your mind. He engages all your senses. And this issue of Swamp Thing hinged on a smell that's identified later in the story as the smell that kids smell when they're burning ants with a magnifying glass, is the reference Alan makes at one point. So he is now engaging the reader's sense of smell. This pushes this comic into an even more intimate reading dimension than any other comic we had done at this point in Swamp Thing. And here is how I drew that splash page. I took Alan's description for page 3, in which he wanted 5 panels in a vertical page. And I went, no. I want this to be a double page spread, because I knew page 1 of every comic opens to a spread. And I took Alan's description of a vertical splash page and I made it the top 2/3 of a double page spread. Okay, so I honored Alan's directions, but I pushed it further, because what was happening on page 3 is essentially exposition, a conversational exchange between Abby and Swamp Thing before the events that lead to what you saw on page 1. He's backtracking. Also note how I try to use every aspect of this page, right? We could not get away with nudity in a comic. This is pre-Vertigo. We're submitting this book to the code. So Alan's calling for Abby being naked. We've seen her clothes on the floor, but I can't show any part of her anatomy that would upset the code. So I threw her figure into partial shadow. John, being John, took the ass end of Abby Cable and on his own did that amazing collage. I did not pencil those bizarre forms in there. I drew that all in pencil as black mass. And whenever we got a script from Alan, it was also mailed to John Totleben. This is the arrangement we'd worked out with Len Wein, starting with issue 21. As soon as I saw the script, John saw the script. This is how closely we worked as artists. So I said, John, Alan wants this, completely screwy, disgusting, bug thing. Go to town. Because I knew, that's where John was going to get his jollies. And oh my God, did he ever deliver? Look at that. Then notice how I use the design of the panels. I have Abby with her eye framed by her hair, and then I designed the top edge of what would have been panel 1 on page 3 into Abby turning her face down to the floor, and it's her silhouette of her profile that pulls you down into the flashback, okay? So every aspect of this page, I'm trying to use some part of the storyteller's toolkit. By the way, I also mentioned to you, John Costanza was our letterer, but I would always pencil in the story titles, and that lettering font that you see on Swamp Thing and on Love and Death is cribbed from the United Artists posters for the Sergio Leone Westerns, A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More. I love that lettering, and nobody ever used it again except on Westerns. And I used it all the time. In fact, if you have seen Tyrant 1 through 4, I was still using that lettering font for the chapter titles in Tyrant. I love that lettering. I think it's a great font. Okay, this is the spread that lost us the code. Yes.
Excuse me. I had a doubt about the technique of the brushing in the last panel, which in the last slide which you showed. What material did John Totleben use for the strokes?
That's all brush and pen, Abu.
Brush and pen.
Right. John could do those strokes freehand. John, I used to share a house with John Totleben, Tom Yates, and Rick Veach after we graduated Kubert School. John would occasionally come down to Vermont and stay for a couple of days when we were behind on an issue, and we would work together. John can do those strokes on Abby's leg and on her back. He can do that freehand, and it takes him seconds. He whips his hand. It's a very strong freehand stroke.
Did you ever ink any of your own books in Swamp Thing? Did you ink any
No.
issues?
I would occasionally ink a singular face, a skull or something like that, and I would do it with John's permission and knowledge and with Karen Berger's permission and knowledge. But I would only do it for a special reason. Like there's one issue, the second part of the Water Vampire story, Greg Irons, the great underground American artist, had just died. And I wanted to have a little homage to Greg Irons. And Greg Irons famously designed the Skull Comics logo for Last Gasp back in the 70s. And I inked one of the skulls that's on the ground to make it look like a Greg Irons skull. But no, The way our collaboration worked, Abu, to finish answering the question is, I would do freehand pencil strokes to indicate to John the direction that I wanted the lines to go. If you look closely at all those lines, they all pull your eye down to Abby's face and that eye, her eye, and it pulls you down to panel 2, the beginning of the flashback sequence. So I would indicate in my pencils the direction of the lines, but I knew in my mind's eye exactly what John was going to do, and he would do it. So the lines on her thigh, on her back, on her shoulder, that's with brush. The lines on her hand, where she's cradling herself, that's pen. And John could just do it.
Superb.
John could just do
Superb.
it. Yeah, he's amazing.
I mean, the focus over the eye, I mean, it's very dreamlike. I mean, it's like seeing a nightmare.
Oh yeah, this was all about trying to give you nightmares, my friend. Okay, also to answer a question that may come up, the way we did this kind of double page spread, this is the one that lost us the code. That background image of Arcane, that was drawn on a sheet of translucent plastic, an acetate that dropped over the illustration board. I penciled all this on a single sheet of illustration board. John inked everything you see with black lines on the board, and then the entire Anton Arcane, everything that's in red on the top part of the drawing, was inked in black on the translucent acetate with instructions to the production department that that would be printed only in red, in magenta, actually. And it had to have a yellow background so that the magenta color, which is actually an off red, would shift to bright red. And we knew exactly what it was going to look like. And you know, John always took it to the nth degree. So this lost the code initially because of the flies coming out of the zombies' heads, right? The code didn't read, the code wasn't reading comics. They would look at comics. And they got to this page and they went, oh, flies coming out of The Walking Dead. That's too far. You lose the code. And I was already penciling the annual number 2, the long story Down Amongst the Dead Man. I was already penciling that at the time all the troubles happened with the code. And Karen Berger calls me up and says, Steve, we lost the code. And she explained why. And I said, well, Karen, I'm sending you, we were using Federal Express at that time. I'm FedExing some of the annual pencils to you. Let me put something in the package to counter the code. And what I did is I went into our local newspaper. A couple of zombie movies were playing at the drive-in down in northern Massachusetts, and I cut out the ads for the 2 zombie movies, and they had flies in the ad graphics. And I said, if it's okay for a family newspaper, what's the problem with the code? Well,
Exactly.
in the meantime, the code read the issue. And the punchline here, just say uncle, is indicative of the fact that her husband, Matt Cable, is possessed by her dead uncle, Arcane. And the code went, that's incest. And Alan Moore famously said, well, growing up with the royal family, I didn't see the problem, really. That didn't carry any weight with the code. And there was no time to fix this. There were other complicating factors as well. But the key thing was that there was no time to change it. The book had to go to the printers. It was already almost late. And the book went out without the code because they couldn't afford to change it. Now, I'll just remind you, and where are we at with time, John?
Okay, Stephen, it is
I'm over.
It is 2:18.
Okay, so I'll
But I
wind this
think
up.
if people are okay with, you know, with going over a little bit, I think everybody probably is all right.
Okay,
it's very enjoyable, man. The details that you're giving are fantastic, and I love your explanation of making them lay magenta over yellow.
No, okay.
You knew it was coming. So if everybody's cool with that, if you can hang on,
I'll keep going, and then I'll cut it off for Q&A, and then you all decide whether we do a wrap up or we just cut it off there. So I'll just remind you what we were dealing with the code. I'll also let you know something. When Karen Berger called me and said we lost the code, you know, me being me, my first question for Karen was, can I get a copy of the code? No. Nobody at DC had a copy of the code. Nobody could mail me a copy of the code. Nobody could get a current copy of the code to us, even though we were now in trouble because we had just broken the code's restrictions. I didn't know that the code, I knew they had been revised, but I had never seen what I'm showing you right now. I had never seen that bottom paragraph that I already read to you about, you know. But notice the code still did not allow scenes dealing with the Walking Dead at this time, okay? We broke that. We shattered that with this. And we mounted the argument, however ineffective it may have been, the flies had to be there. It was a story point. The agent of reanimation, to go back to the point of this lecture being presented here in this scientific August body, is the agent of reanimation were insects inside the bodies. We had to show them. It had been set up as a story point from page 1 with the smell that Abby can't identify. Okay, here's a even rarer excerpt I'm sharing with you all. This is, I kept every letter I got from Alan and John and Karen and Len back in the day. This is an excerpt from an October 1984 letter from Alan Moore. This is what fans forget. Alan wasn't just writing Swamp Thing. Quote, he's suffering burnout. Since I last wrote, I've done 2 episodes of DR and Quinch, 1 episode of The Battle of Halo Jones, 1 10-page plot synopsis of the forthcoming top secret Batman Judge Dredd crossover. Think on that one, folks. 8 pages of sample dialogue for Same, 1 V for Vendetta, 1 Bo Jeffries saga, 1 Marvel Man, Swamp Thing 29, Swamp Thing 29 again, an episode or 2 of Green Arrow, an issue of Vigilante, a 10-page text feature for Knockabout Comics, 5 Maxwell the Magic Cats, which Alan wrote and drew for his local Northampton, UK paper, the text piece for The Sampler, and blargle, blargle, blargle. Having to rewrite 29 was, well, you see, a real fucking bastard. Now, what happened with Swamp Thing 29, which I want to bring to your attention, is Alan wrote what became part 1 of the Nuke Face papers, and that was supposed to be Swamp Thing 29. When Karen Berger got the script, she said, Alan, this is a really good script, but we're picking up readers with every issue. Circulation's going up. It's too funereal in pacing. I need a real knock dead horror issue. And Alan turned around and wrote the Swamp Thing 29 we ended up doing in about 2 days' time, out of nowhere, right? He pulled that out of his butt. Having to rewrite 29 was a real bastard. I could see Karen's point about the story being a bit slow and downbeat for a time when we were hoping to pull in new readers, but I was still heartbroken. I'd written it so that it was set in the swamps, but with lots of really haunting dreamlike flashbacks to the ruined landscape. The scenes with Nukeface and his drinking buddy, while they were really slow, I thought captured a nice sense of excruciating torture and gradual hideous poisoning. Still, she says we can use it eventually, maybe when the book sales have picked up a little. Let's hope this is soon. Here's Alan apologizing for one of the greatest horror comics I ever got to draw. I'm sorry about the replacement story. I had to rush it through in 3 days in order to keep within any sort of schedule at all, and I'm still not sure about the end result. I think I'd rather have taken things a bit more slowly, but maybe it'll look okay once you and John have worked your superlative squirmy sorcery upon it. While we're on the subject, I've been thinking about this Swamp Thing annual, which I now understand you and John are going to be doing, which is supposed to be coming out either alongside of or just before the fill-in issue 32. Okay, and then it goes on. I'll leave this up for a moment so those of you who can read and listen to me. So we put together that issue that lost the code under very tight deadline restrictions, and Alan wrote it out of nowhere in a matter of days. What's amazing is Alan is already looking down the road at the annual, and it's funny that the last line of this portion of the letter, "We'll do something that'll make the Evil Dead look like a Frank Capra film," turned out to be true for Swamp Thing 29, the issue that lost us the code. You never know what the agent of reanimation may be, is my point here. Here's another excerpt from an earlier letter from Alan a month before. This is a note on the original Swamp Thing script. I tried to phone Karen a minute ago, but she was engaged, so I still don't know what she thought to the first part of Nukeface, although it's a little late to change it now, I suppose, even if she doesn't like it. I was glad you people liked it at least. Alan, by this time, was sending his scripts copies direct to John and I from England. if I do the second part well, I think we'll have made a neat and nasty little statement about something important. Well, all of that indeed ended up being used. About a half year later, with the two-part Nuke Face papers in Swamp Thing 35 and 36, these are the covers of those two issues. And I just wanted to close this talk by showing you those issues, and also letting you know that Nuke Face was also a character that had come out of John Totleben. Nuke Face was created by John Totleben long before any of us were working on Swamp Thing, even before Tom Yates was working on Swamp Thing. John had done a sketch on a piece of paper at the home we all shared in New Jersey at the time, and he just labeled it Nuke Face. And we loved the drawing. All of us were like, "Whoa, John, what is this?" And he said, "Oh, I think it's like a wino who drinks toxic waste." And that became the genesis for the Nuke Face papers. It was also an attack on what was happening with toxic waste, nuclear waste, toxic chemical waste, and so on at the time. And while I was penciling these issues, all of these newspaper pieces that run through the story were actual newspaper stories that came out as I was penciling the issue. I didn't have to go looking. I would just go into the Wilmington pharmacy every other day. I didn't have the money to buy the papers every day. I would go in every other day, buy 3 or 4 newspapers, including the New York Times and the local Massachusetts papers. And there was always stories about toxic waste spills, chemical spills, nuclear waste hazards every day in our local paper. The one change we had to make, and this wasn't because of the code, this was our editor Karen Berger's call. On the left are my pencils of the final disintegration of Nuke Face's drinking buddy in Swamp Thing 34. And that's a photocopy of my pencils. And Karen Berger called up John and said, "John, you got to tone that down. Steve went too far." And on the right are John's inks of my pencils. If you have ever looked at photos of those those air-dried mummies in Mexico and parts of Spain, you know how grotesque the human anatomy gets when subjected to certain forces, and that's where I went with whatever Nuke Face is drinking. But this is a case of a change called for by the editor, not by the code. One more excerpt of an Alan Moore letter. We were plotting our issues way in advance. In fact, John and I co-plotted issues we never got to work on. I also sent Alan story ideas by friends of mine. My good friend Jim Wheelock, who thankfully is still with us and living in Los Angeles. Hello, Jim. Hope you're doing okay today. Jim Wheelock was the one who suggested to me, you guys have to do a story set in the Winchester Mansion. And I asked Jim if he could send me flyers and brochures from that tourist attraction. And Jim did. He sent me 3 or 4 copies of the brochures so that I could mail one to John Totleben, mail one to Alan Moore, give one to Rick Beach. And this is how far ahead we were planning what became the American Gothic. Sadly, by then, I had left the book. That issue, Jim Wheelock's story idea, became Swamp Thing 45. I got to draw the cover, which is my ode to the Sergio Leone Westerns, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Fistful of Dollars for a few dollars more. But Stan Walk was the person penciling the issue because I'd already stepped away from the book. I had emotionally disengaged. Another excerpt from a letter. This is Alan talking to me about which characters he wanted to bring in. He thought that he would want to bring in characters at the bottom of the list, just ahead of Sugar and Spike and Brother Power the Geek. The thing is, DC keeps offering me superhero stuff, probably on the strength of Marvel Man. What they don't seem to realize is that I don't really like superheroes all that much, which is why Marvel Man at one level is an utter rejection of the last 35 years of superhero comics. And obviously Alan took that right pedal to the metal with Dave Gibbons with Watchmen. I also would regularly send Alan my pencils. As I turned them in to Karen Berger via FedEx, I would pop the pencils in the snail mail to Alan, and Alan would comment on the pencils. And it was a real strong chemistry that we had. And I'm sharing these with you because I do want you to understand that one of the catalytic agents in the reanimation of Swamp Thing was very much the creative chemistry between Alan Moore, myself, John Totleben, Rick Beach, and our editors, Len Wein and Karen Berger. By this point, Karen had finally been talking with Alan about what we might be able to do after having lost the code. And after we lost the code, we didn't up the horror quotient, which kind of surprised Karen. We upped the love quotient. And it was losing the code that allowed us to do The Rites of Spring, the issue in which Abby and Swamp Thing consummate their relationship. And this whole issue came out of a postcard I'd sent Alan, where I wrote on a postcard saying, you know, if Abby was a real woman, with everything we've put her through, she'd be in a mental asylum by now. Why don't we do one issue where Abby and Swamp Thing just have a good day in the swamp? And Alan took that idea, and Alan being Alan, turned it into this incredible issue in which Abby and Swamp Thing get to consummate their relationship via a psychedelic trip in the green, the realm of the vegetable world. And penciling this entire sequence and working with the 2-page spread, opening up what was possible on the comic page was very much my ode to the underground comics that had had such a reanimating and transformative impact on me when I was a kid in high school and my first couple of years of college. I think I'll wrap it up there. We continued working together on Swamp Thing for a time. We did our water vampire story. Another plot idea I'd suggested to Alan that we did end up doing together was a woman's case of lycanthropy being tied into her menstrual cycle. We did Voodoo and Zombies in American Gothic, but I left the series. I stayed on to do covers. I occasionally would script a guest issue. I did script issues 59 and 78 and one of the annuals. And I returned to the series to co-pencil what turned out to be Alan Moore's final issue, Swamp Thing number 64, cover painting by John Totleben. And I finally said goodbye, not only to Swamp Thing, but to the entire American mainstream comics industry when John Totleben and I reunited at the request of our friend Neil Gaiman to do the 10-page story, Jack and the Green. And this turned out to be my one and only Vertigo comic story. But we did our part. DC Comics and Swamp Thing editor Karen Berger continued to edit and publish a line of comics that were initially tagged by the Suggested for Mature Readers banner across the top of the comic: Swamp Thing, John Constantine Hellblazer, The Sandman, Animal Man, Shade the Changing Man, Doom Patrol, and Neil Gaiman and Dave McKean's Black Orchid miniseries. And then Karen Berger and DC launched the adult Vertigo imprint in 1983, which by its very nature refuted the Comics Code Authority and built on the bedrock of our losing the code with Swamp Thing 29. 2011, goodbye Comics Code Authority, and that's all, folks. I can take questions, and these are some of the folks I have to thank who either helped me with research or provided me with tidbits of information that were part of what you just saw. Okay, I will pop out of screen share. You decide, John, how we handle Q&A. I've gone over time. It's 2:33. I went 3 minutes over, and I apologize.
You did good, man. I love it. First of all, I just want to thank you, Stephen. Man, so good. I had seen a part of this lecture before, but man, there were so many. It's so rich with detail. It's beautiful. This is being recorded, just so everybody knows. It will be on our website in a day or two, so you'll be able to revisit. What we'll do with Q&A is if you raise your hand via the reactions down there on your right-hand bottom, and Josh has already got his hand up, that'll just keep us from talking over each other. It'll keep it a little bit civilized. So Josh, go ahead with your question for Stephen. Josh Moisley.
Thank you. It's not as much a question as just an observation. One, yeah, Steve, great to see you. I also saw Swamp Thing at the Paramount back in the day. Who thought of the anatomy lesson mirroring the anatomy of a murder?
That was me. That was me. When I would do the what Josh is referring to is that design of the title page where the anatomy lesson title was, and there was that sort of broken figure of a human being.
Yeah.
That was lifted verbatim from the great Saul Bass design for the movie poster for Otto Preminger's Anatomy of a Murder, which came out, I think, around 1958 or 59. And Yeah, I'm a shameless thief of movie lettering, and when the graphic is of use, I'll go there as well, as you see. Good catch, Josh. I
Well-
should know that a filmmaker would have caught it.
Right. If you think of like, I was struck by listening to your whole lecture today, which was fabulous and wonderful, had me cracking up and taught me things I didn't even know about, some work I thought I knew really well. But I was really struck by how much your role in the creation of the comic book is akin to a film director, because you're getting the script from the screenwriter, but then you are kind of creating the actors, what they look like, you're framing, all that kind of stuff. And then there's other people who have other collaborative process. But I was really struck by that today, something I had not thought of.
You know, I'll let me go back to that splash page, if I may. I'm clocking to it, and then I'll do a screen share. Okay.
And I see you, Mark. We'll get Mark next after.
Okay.
Stephen's address this.
Let's see. Can I go back to screen sharing?
Should be able to just go down to that bottom green button there.
There we
Yep.
go.
There you go.
Okay. Play from current slide. Okay, I'm going to go back one. There we go. Okay, so Josh, it's interesting you bring that up. Here's the beginning of the anatomy lesson. Here's the Saul Bass graphic that that I lifted that Josh was asking about. So bear in mind, on this page, Alan Moore's script direction was for a 6-panel grid, 6, maybe 7 panels.
Yeah, that's cool.
And it was my idea to take Alan's suggestion of the window panes as panels and really turn that into the visual motif that frames the whole issue. So Alan had decided, okay, we're going to have Woodrue looking out the window. And on page 1, he's the human Jason Woodrue. And on the last page of the issue, we see the Floronic man, the plant being version of Woodrue, looking out the window. It wasn't my idea, it was Alan's idea. But once Alan gave me that idea, I ran with it. And to me, window panes are panels. Those are comic panels. So I redesigned the entire page to make the breakup of the close-up Alan called for, which I imagine would have been panel 4 in his directions, of Woodrue looking out. And I broke it into the sequential panels and then had the flashback that the reader doesn't understand, that what they're looking at is the death of a character, and used that as a page design component. So I don't know if it's, in a way it's film directing, Josh, but in another way, you know, there was a collaboration, and I won't name the people involved because it ended up going acrimonious, sadly, even though they did tremendous work together. There was a collaboration that I published in Taboo between a writer and an artist, where there was an argument about how they were going to credit one another. And the writer saw the artist as the cinematographer, and the artist saw themselves as the director. And this became a real emotional ego minefield. It's part of why I guess I'm skirting the question still, Josh. I don't want to get in trouble here. For me, my job in one way might be comparable to a director, but it's also, you know, it's closer to the relationship between a writer like Mike Maltese and an animator like Chuck Jones. Okay, and so I'll use the animation model rather than the live action film model. But if a live action filmmaker like yourself sees it as such, I bow to your wisdom and knowledge, oh my friend.
Well, hey, I would just say this. I want to just chime in there, and then we'll get to Mark, and then I see Dr. Ben Anthony. When I first saw that panel, that's what really got me. That's what I really wanted to know, because I can really see now your artistic interpretation just really drives the narrative there. And second thing I want to say is, what a glutton for punishment when you had to draw all those little squares.
Hey,
I salute you for that.
panel borders are easy to draw. Don't think otherwise.
No, but I mean every little window pane in the
Oh, yeah,
the other panels there, man. Glutton for punishment. I want to reach out to Mark real quick.
Okay, but one last thing I'll mention in answer to that question.
Certainly.
There was one filmmaker that both Alan Moore and I referenced to each other in our initial letters, and that was Nicholas Roeg, R-O-E-G. If you're interested in the connection and the impact of any aspect of cinema on the work that Alan John, Rick, and I were doing together on Swamp Thing. The importance of Nicholas Roeg's work to Alan and I cannot be overstated. And specifically the film's Performance from 1970, Walkabout from 1971, Don't Look Now from 1973, one of my all-time favorite films, and The Man Who Fell to Earth with David Bowie from 76. If you're interested in this connection that Josh raised with his question, look at those 4 films and then reread the work we did on Swamp Thing. And I defer now to John and Mark. And hello, Mark. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Of
Mark.
course, you know my question is going to be about reanimation and about the philosophy behind the changes that you guys made on Swamp Thing. I'm really, why did you guys decide, in a way, breaking from the tradition of the reanimation theme, to really embrace metamorphosis and change? I mean, he after 3 issues of a coma, he really embraces and learns what his new powers are. I always felt that was one of the breakthroughs and core wonderful things about Swamp Thing. So how did you and Alan and John basically approach that?
Part of it came out of the imperative that John Tolliban had felt and had articulated for years before our ever knowing Alan, much less working with him. John Tolliban really, John would talk about what was possible with Swamp Thing and that nobody was doing, right? And it was a frustration for us too, because Len Wein, co-creator of Swamp Thing, right? The writer who created Swamp Thing was the editor on the book, and he made it clear he thought that was too, Len's word, as I recall, was radical. It was too radical. By the time we were working with Alan collaboratively on the book, we felt like a generational imperative to embrace change. And I'll give you a clear contemporary example, Mark, which was at the time we were working on the book, Clive Barker's The Books of Blood were being published a volume at a time in paperback in the UK only. They weren't available yet in America. And Alan, in phone conversations and in letters, said, you guys have to read this, meaning John and I. Rick was never that interested in horror. There's a reason that when Rick Veitch and Alan worked together on Swamp Thing after I left the book, that the tenor of the book shifted from horror to science fiction. That was more, Rick's comfort zone. And by then, Alan was ready to shift gears. And as you recall, they kept going with the theme of transformation. But when we were working the book, Alan started mailing us a book at a time as they came out on the paperback shelves in England, The Books of Blood. And I remember reading the first volume of The Books of Blood by Clive Barker, and it was mind-blowing. And it was mind-blowing because there was nothing conservative about Clive Barker's fiction. If there's one theme that runs through Clive Barker's fiction at that time, it's change or die. And we really were feeling that as a generation at that time, right? Alan Moore famously was involved with various political activism movements in the UK. And, my first wife, Marlene, and I, we were living like hippies in the backwoods of Vermont. Our kids were born at home birth. I mean, change or die was really an imperative for us in our day-to-day life. And it was certainly an imperative for us in the work we were doing. And that manifests, Mark, in Swamp Thing, 100%. And I think that's part of why we ran with it so emphatically. Now, why Len suddenly embraced what he had rejected before, I can't tell you. Len was a huge fan of pop culture. I mean, the fun I had working with Len during those few issues we worked together is Len would call me if he saw a movie that he thought Bissette should see, right? That was part of our relationship. I think Len was so in love with what Alan had done in Warrior magazine with Marvel Man and with V for Vendetta, that I think that was the decisive catalytic agent, if you will, in Len going, okay, I'll go with this, right? You guys have a good idea. You clearly know what you want. I'm not going to hold it up. It may have also been, Len may have known, I'm sticking with the book for 4 more issues, so they can't fuck it up worse than it is. Another aspect of that, which I'll use to conclude my answer to you, Mark, is that was happening in comics across the board. Like the sales on Swamp Thing were so close to cancellation that the book almost got canceled before Alan scripted his first issue. John Tollivan vividly remembers and shared some of those memories with me recently, how under the gun we were with issue 19, 20, 21. We were drawing those simultaneously practically, because the book was so close to cancellation that if we went off schedule, that's all DC needed to cancel it. And our role model was what Frank Miller had just done on Daredevil, right? We were coming on the heels of seeing Frank Miller, a fellow Vermonter, by the way, not born in Vermont, but raised in Vermont. And so we very much felt like we're following Frank's footsteps. We're taking a character that's near cancellation. Nobody's paying attention to it. Nobody's done what's possible with it. And we can't make it worse than it is. And that in no way is reflective of the work that Marty Pasco and Tom Yates had done. But prior to that, you know, Swamp Thing was like a guest star in Challengers of the Unknown. I mean, DC had given up on the character completely. So I think that empowered us, that 1-2 punch of, they're going to cancel it, so we might as well push the envelope, and that change or die imperative that we felt generationally. Clearly, Alan was feeling it in the United Kingdom. I mean, this is during the Thatcher era. The entire culture was imploding. All the, you know, social support structures that Alan had grown up with had been torn away. It was just caving in. And here we are, you know, on the part of the tidal wave that the punk movement was part of. And shake it up, baby. So.
All right, thanks for the question, Mark. Ben.
I had a doubt.
Oh,
yeah.
Abu, hey, wait, Abu, hold on one second. Ben's had his hand up for a minute, then I'll get to you, okay?
Okay.
Right, go ahead, Ben.
All right, does that work? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yep.
Excellent. Okay. First of all, it's fantastic to be able to talk with you. My introduction to your work was, of course, your series Tyrant, right? Like I knew about Swamp Thing. You guys were legends by then, but when I came in was reading the Tyrant books, and something that I've always wondered, looking at your work in Swamp Thing, and then there was a couple issues you did a series with Veach. It was called Bedlam.
Oh yeah, yeah.
How much of Tyrant was gestating in your mind when you were doing these different works, like that splash page from Crisis? There's a huge dinosaur. I don't know if that was in the script. I haven't read that.
Alan put it in the script because he knew I loved to draw dinosaurs. So
Okay.
you know, at that point, Alan was doing anything he could to keep me interested. So yeah, you got it. You tagged it.
Okay, so that was just like a constant, like you're just a constant love of dinosaurs.
You know, my dream of doing Tyrant started, and I'm not exaggerating, Ben, when I was 4. I mean, the first drawing I ever did that an adult recognized as what I had in my head was a dinosaur. That was my first love as an artist. And I would say all through my professional life, starting in 1976, I wanted to do what became Tyrant. There was a frustration there in that I wanted to do a dinosaur comic about dinosaurs, but anytime the freelance work would present itself, it didn't have to do with dinosaurs. It was a time travel story that had 2 pages of dinosaurs, or it was a Lost World story that 2/3 of it was these bullshit characters I didn't want to draw anyway, getting to the Lost World, what have you. You know the templates as well as anybody here.
Right.
And I wanted to do, you know, the inspiration for me were some of the books I'd grown up with as a kid, which were, and don't laugh, folks, Black Beauty, okay, Bambi. My all-time favorite, Ernest Thomas Setton's books, Jack London's White Fang, books that I read and loved because they were from the point of view of an animal. And I wanted to do a dinosaur comic that had minimal anthropomorphizing and maximum put the reader in these creatures' mindset. And I finally launched Tyrant when I did, Ben, because I was finally at a point in my life where nobody could say no to me. I had made enough money off 1963, the series that I collaborated on with Alan and Rick and Don Simpson and John Totleben and Dave Gibbons and Chester Brown and many others for Image. I had earned enough money that I had 2 years to work on whatever I wanted. My marriage had fallen apart, so even my first wife couldn't say no. And I had exhausted every possible strategy of approaching an editor or a publisher with the idea. And they would all say, no, nobody will buy that, or no, we have something just like it. And whatever they had just like it wasn't at all like it. And so I did it. And oddly enough, I mean, it was that, you know, even when you carry something all your life, it's out there. It's like the same year I did Tyrant, Ricardo Delgado launched the terrific Age of Reptiles. And it was like, oh, excellent. Like, it didn't bum me out. It was like, excellent, right? It's like, this is in the cultural zeitgeist. It's going to manifest in the world. Oh, I must have said something. And you know, I've gotten emails from friends and fans saying, "Oh, this, you know, Todd Galusha's book Cretaceous must really piss you off. It's like Tyrant." And I'm like, "No, man, I love it. I mean, you know, it's right by my bedside. I'm rereading the work that Todd did on Cretaceous right now, and I got to work with Jim Lawson on Paleo, which was Jim Lawson's dinosaur comic. I got to script a couple of stories for Jim. And I hope to get back to Tyrant, but it's something I've been carrying with me all my life, Ben. The way it ties into Swamp Thing and the conversation today is whenever I worked on a character, I always tried to find and identify the primal essence of that character. And my modus operandi was, how do I get that primal essence on the page? And that fueled Swamp Thing. You know, even look at the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle stories. I did a couple of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle stories, and one of them was about the primal essence of their relationship with Splinter. And I really tried to get to the core of that. Like, what is the tie between these 5 mutants? And you know, it made for a very bizarre, strange story. But luckily, Peter Laird and Kevin Eastman were like, "Yeah, we love it. We'll print it." So that and Tyrant, you know, is part of that imperative as well. I want to put the readers in the mindset of these creatures. I don't want you outside looking in. I want you inside experiencing it. And I try to do that if I'm an artist working with a writer, as I did on Swamp Thing. But when I write and draw my own work, it's the same imperative. And thank you for liking Tyrant. With
I love it.
With the help of Dr. Michael Ryan, I hope to be back to work at it. But once again, I'll be self-publishing. So just nature of the beast.
Well, okay, 1 second. I'm going to do, I got 2 comments, and then we're going to do Abu, and then we've got, oh shoot. I hope I didn't lose it, Flavio. So a couple comments real quick. I just want to give you as compliments, Steve. We've got from James, he say, hey, Stephen, check out Jenny Tartakovsky's Primal if you haven't already. It's a great
Yeah, I'm waiting for it to come out on, I only watch things on physical media, so I'm waiting for that legal or illegal DVD or Blu-ray edition. If any of you want to take that as a motive for mailing me a burned set of discs, I will not say no. You might want to leave that out of the recorded version when you put this out there, John. Yeah, I'm dying to see it.
It's suggestive. It's not saying names. And then Victor and Flavio say, hey, I'd put $100 right now on a Tyrant Kickstarter.
You know, the problem with Kickstarter, crowdfunding is a lot of work. It's a lot of work. I mean, I taught for 15 years. I have seen, I cannot tell you how many students and graduates do Kickstarter and crowdfunding. It is a remarkable means that didn't used to exist of not only publishing, but self-distributing and self-promoting. I'd rather be at the drawing board, right? Doing a Kickstarter involves months of work. And I've already self-published since the late 80s. You know who shipped out, you know who packed those boxes of Taboo that went out when they were reorders? Me, these hands. And I'm sure all of you would rather have these hands at my drawing board instead of trying to, you know, fabricate a Kickstarter. I'm going to do the work first. And because of print on demand with, you know, the devil and, you know, the largest devil in the room, Amazon, it'll probably be a print on demand book first. Once the work's done, I don't need a publisher, you know. It's like, and I'm a shameless huckster and promoter, as Mark Asquith can certainly attest to. If I got to do that anyway, then I'll do it myself. I will find a way to get it out there, as long as God willing, nature willing, I live long enough. But I'm doing my best to keep in good health, folks. So.
Right on. Thank you. Okay, Abu, it's you next. Go ahead with your question or comment.
Yeah. Hello, Steve.
Hello, Abu.
I had a question. Hello. I had a question about John Constantine and his creation. How did you come up with the creation of John Constantine, and what was Sting's reaction? Sting,
Okay,
he was
okay.
very popular.
I'll give you the answer to this, and I will make it as short as I can. It's a long story, but I'll boil it down. One,
Sure.
I had a classmate at the Kubert School, the great Ernie Passman, who was in my class, and we used to have a running joke between each other, and pardon my language, Ernie would put in the background of his assignments graffiti that said, Bissette eats shit. And I would put graffiti in the background of my assignments that said, Passman eats shit. When we graduated from the Kubert School, Ernie and John Tottleben got together and decided that, well, Ernie was going to work in another profession altogether. He was not going to pursue a cartooning career. So he deeded this fake rivalry to John Tottleben. So John Tottleben and I began to put in the backgrounds of our comic stories, Tottleben eats shit, and Tottleben would put Bissette eats shit. And I know readers saw it because we used to go to conventions. We'd sit together, we're friends. And there was one guy who came up at one show and went, you guys like talk to each other? Because he'd seen the graffiti in our comics and he thought we were mortal enemies. This turned into, when we started working on Swamp Thing, we knew we couldn't get away with Tottleben eats shit, Bissette eats shit in a code-approved comic for DC Comics. So we changed the game to sneaking Gumby into every issue of Swamp Thing. And if you don't know who Gumby is, go on YouTube, type in Gumby, G-U-M-B-Y.
I know the green guy.
Yeah,
green
a clay animation character. He was part of my childhood. He had been on TV since I was a kid. And we snuck Gumby into Swamp Thing. He is in Swamp Thing number 16. He is upside down in the form of this sort of worm monster with antlers that attacks Swamp Thing in Swamp Thing 17. And at that point, Len Wein called me up and he didn't even say hello. I picked up the phone. This is before caller ID. I pick up the phone and I hear Len Wein's voice go, you are playing a very dangerous game, young man. And I thought, oh my God, I'm too late with the pencils, or I'm going to be fired, or Steve, no more Gumbies. You have to stop this Gumby fixation that you have. So John and I went, okay, we can't have Gumby. Let's come up with something we can sneak in that Len Wein won't recognize. John was a big fan of the band The Police. I had seen Quadrophenia, where Sting plays essentially a silent character named Ace Face, and he had a great face. And John and I decided, let's sneak Sting into the background. And it fell into Swamp Thing number 25, Saga of the Swamp Thing number 25. When the guy gets killed by the stuffed swordfish flying off the car, there's a crowd that Abby is part of, and Sting is right behind her. And at this point, we had already let Alan Moore know, we're going to keep doing this. You better make him a character. And it was Alan who took this game, this silly cartoonist game that John and I were playing, and said, right, I'll make him an occult detective. And I love that. You know, I had grown up reading occult detective weird fiction from the old Weird Tales, pulps and everything. Alan's model was closer to Michael Moorcock with novels like The Final Program. Once Alan introduced Constantine, you know, and to the last part of your question, Abu, I don't know what Sting thought of it. He never sued DC. John and I never lied about where he came from. I mean, right from the start with our interviews, when people asked, we went, oh, it's Sting. I always suspected when they made the film that they cast Keanu Reeves because he was the furthest you could get from Sting with a bankable movie star at that time in terms of how he looked and carried himself. I gather from, you know, what Alan had told us back in the days when Alan would talk to me, and I gather from what I've read, you know, in the press sense, that Sting was fine with it and kind of digs it. So in the best of all worlds, there'll be another Constantine movie or series, and they'll get Sting in on a guest shot, and then we'll really know Abu where he stands with all this.
Absolutely. Also, Eddie Campbell. When did you meet Eddie Campbell for Taboo? And did you
I first
did
met
you
Eddie.
oh, sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
Like, did you recommend Alan Moore to taken Eddie Campbell to draw from
Yeah.
Hell?
Yeah, I first met Eddie Campbell. John Toddleman and I first met Eddie Campbell at I think the first or second UCAC, the United Kingdom Comic Arts Convention that was in London, and that would have been around 84, 85. We hit it off with Eddie to the point where he invited us down to his home with his first wife Anne, and I think they were in Brighton, is where we went and spent an overnight. And Eddie showed me a photocopy of a comic he had done, and it was that one pager that we ran in Taboo 1. He had already sold the original art off, and he had the photocopy, and I said, "Oh, I can print from this." And yeah, I'm the one when Alan came to me with the idea of From Hell. It wasn't just an idea. Alan dictated all 16 chapters to me over the phone in our first conversation about From Hell. He had it all plotted out. And then we were talking about, well, who could we get to draw this? And any name that came up, the problem I saw, and a couple of names that came up I'll mention, because they're both friends of mine. I don't think they take offense. John Toddleman, Brian Talbot. The problem I saw is that, like me, as a cartoonist, drawing the murders, we would inevitably fetishize the violence, right? I mean, it's part of our drawing style. We would inevitably fetishize the violence involved in the murders. And Alan felt strongly, and I agreed with him, that when it got to the Jack the Ripper murders, it should be ugly. It should be repellent. There should be no element of attraction or allure or sensuousness or seduction to it. And Eddie was the one artist I could think of who would approach it in such a pragmatic manner that it would have the emotional resonance that Alan felt, and I agreed as editor and packager on Taboo felt it should have. And Alan was nervous about that because he's like, Eddie won't work on a Jack the Ripper. He hates horror. I had already published a couple of Eddie's pieces in Taboo. So I said, well, I'll break the ice. I'll call Eddie. I don't have a problem with asking. And it was a long phone call.
I mean,
but,
it is a big book.
Oh yeah, and you know, it was 10, 11, 12 years of Eddie's life, and it never stopped. Eddie is still the one that's seeing through, perpetuating and keeping it in print. And so in one way it was a curse, and in another way, I'm still convinced Eddie is the only cartoonist that could have collaborated on From Hell and pulled it off and done it the way it needed to be done. And yeah, I was the one. It also came out of, I had just read in Escape magazine, Paul Gravette's terrific comic zine that he co-edited and co-published, an interview that was Alan and Eddie talking in a diner. It was a conversation between the two, and it was clear they would enjoy working together at some point. So I also had that to go on. So so there it is. That's how it happened. And Eddie was great to work with. If anything, he was frustrated with the slowness of the publication, but we could only publish the chapters as quick as they were done. And as you know, if you've read From Hell, some of those chapters are 40 pages long, you know.
Very dense, very dense.
And Taboo was the only anthology at the time that would have given that kind of license. You know, we said any page count, anything you want to do is what we wanted from the creators, and we worked around that. But it did mean that, you know, we had to wait until the chapters were done. And despite Eddie's frustration, I will point out that to stay on schedule, we put out Taboo Especial, which had no chapter From Hell and was even called Especial because I didn't want to put out a numbered volume of Taboo without From Hell in it. So to stay on schedule while they were finishing the chapter at hand, we got that volume out. And that's what I got.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
All right, we got one more. I think we're just going to take this last one, which was
Is that Flavio's question?
Yeah, it's
I read it. Okay,
talk
so
about 60.
Yeah, Flavio asked about an issue I was not directly involved with, but that I know about, which was Saga the Swamp Thing, or Swamp Thing by that time, number 60, Loving the Alien. And it was an issue where John Toddleman did most of the artwork first, and then Alan scripted it. And then John did some additional pages that Alan called for to pull it all together. I'll say this, Flavio and everyone there. There was an approach to working in comics that was common to John Toddleman and myself, and that was we love music. And unlike John, I am not a musician. The only instrument I ever tried to teach myself to play was harmonica. And you should thank your lucky stars you have never been in a room where there was me playing a harmonica anywhere in proximity of your ears. But John plays guitar and has as long as I've known him. And we see it as music. And my metaphor, which I often use, is jazz. I grew up listening to jazz thanks to my childhood friend James Harvey, who turned me on to musicians like Charlie Parker and Eric Dolphy and Miles Davis when we were quite young. We were, teenagers living in Vermont. And so I always saw jamming on comics as a form of jazz, as a form of music. And one of my great frustrations once I started working professionally was the regimentation of the comics industry. I've only rarely, I think I've only ever inked 2 stories that were penciled by other people because there's no fun in it for me. The work's all done. I'm an engraver. I'm one of the engravers who worked on Gustave Doré's pencils at that point, and I can't possibly do justice to Rick Veitch's pencils on the issue of Tim Truman's Scout that I inked, or or the other piece that I had done. And part of it is it frustrates me because there's no chemistry. There's no creative chemistry. I don't get to sit down with the people who are doing the story and brainstorm. And one of the things that Rick Veitch has said to me he really misses is we used to brainstorm all the time. I mean, that was the cement of our relationship. And I'm difficult to work with. I start working on something and I fucking disappear because I want to get lost in the process, and that doesn't work on a monthly comic. There's a reason I never worked again with Karen Berger. Like, I gave her migraines. I was impossible to work with, and there were other issues. I was a father of 2 kids. I was the one at home with them while my first wife went to work at a day job. That meant I did most of my penciling at night or early mornings. I got up to feed the babies, went to my studio after they went to sleep and penciled. That makes me hard to work with. And I said at the top of this talk, I got people waiting for sketches. That's because I took commissions and it was winter in Vermont coming, and I've just disappeared into my studio and I play. And then when it's done, I mail it out. That doesn't work in the real world. Publishers hate that shit. Editors hate it more because they're answerable to the publishers. So what John and Alan put together was, John had the issue of, I just want to sculpt some comic pages. John's concept was, I'm going to sculpt these pages. They were 3-dimensional pages. John actually had working mechanical parts in some of those pages, digital clocks and so on. And, so the originals had depth as well as width and length, and he sculpted that issue. And Alan took it and ran with it. And that was a creative form of collaboration that is probably as close as I've seen my friend Tim Lucas and his dear friend Simanika Parika Uth jammed on a couple of stories that we published in Taboo. And I believe they were done in a similar way, where Simonita would work up artwork, Tim would work up text, and then they would collaborate in organically pulling it together. And that issue of Swamp Thing is the result of that. And although I wasn't directly involved, I got to see a number of John's originals as they were being worked on, and they were mind-blowing. And what Alan did with it was beautiful. And it was as close as we'll ever see in the world to Alan Moore and John Tollivan jamming on a piece of music. There it is on the comic pages.
Thanks,
and we'll
Steve.
leave it there. We're up to 3:08. I guess we better stop.
That's right. Hey, it has been beautiful. What we're going to do, thank you everybody for questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everybody. Steve gave us even more time than we asked, so I want to thank him so much. I learned so much, and I'm like been studying Swamp Thing for 20 years or so I was like, wow, it just keeps blowing my mind. I want to give Steve a last minute to flog what he is doing now. I've had some requests. How can people support you? What do you got in the works?
Okay, I'll also say there were some questions I didn't get to that people have. If you John, I apologize. If you email them to John and he forwards them to me, I will answer them via email.
No problem.
I've been writing more than drawing these days. I retired from teaching May of 2020, not because of the pandemic, but because I'm 65. I'm tired. And I wanted to get back to the drawing board. And but I still have to support myself. So I've been selling and flogging a lot of sketches and sketch art online. Um, and the creative work that I've done that I would like to steer you all to, if you're interested in the work that I do. I had 2 new books come out last year. One work of nonfiction that very much ties into what we were talking about here today. I did a midnight movie monograph for the Electric Dreamhouse imprint at PS Publications in the UK, and you can look it up online by going to PS Publications, one word, .uk. And the midnight movie monograph I did was about David Cronenberg's The Brood, one of my all-time favorite horror films from 1979. It is a 700-page book that covers not just the genesis, the making, the release, and the aftershocks of that one film, The Brood, but I dug as deeply as I could into the whole nature of parasitological science and science fiction, how David Cronenberg became the primary creative force in the pop culture, moving that forward in the 1970s, and how central that is to the entire horror genre, what horror is, why it's important, how it works on us, and why we need it. And if you're interested, that book, The Brood, is still in print. It's also available from a number of US sources, including Amazon. It's about a $43 book. That's about the price. And no, you cannot buy it from me. I no longer do that kind of thing. The other book I'll flog is I also had a piece of fiction published last year that I'm very proud of. It was a collaborative work. And I was approached by a group of novelists, Stephen Volk, V-O-L-K, and his circle of writers had the idea of doing a book about a fictional British movie studio that didn't exist. They wanted to collect 4 novellas that would read like novelizations of British horror films that had never been made in the 60s and 70s. And they came to me because they wanted someone to write the framing device. And they thought, oh, Steve knows horror movies. He could do this. And I ended up writing not just the framing device, but the interstitials as well that pull the novellas together and presents the fictional case history of Blythewood Studios, a name that Stephen Volk had created and put out there. And it's called Studio of Screams. It's also from PS Publications. I noticed this morning it is available on Amazon in a number of countries, including the US. And I'm really proud of it. And what I ended up writing turned out to be another horror story. So if you're into my horror fiction work, I've written short fiction over the years. This is the latest one. And finally, I'm doing a series of books called Cryptid Cinema. And it's about a genre that nobody seems to have defined as yet, that I always was in love with. And it's involves cryptozoology, yes, Bigfoot, Yeti, the Loch Ness Monster, but it's primarily about that film genre that involves creatures that don't exist but might exist. And what I'm exploring is what are the storytelling templates there? And this means within the fictional universe of cinema, King Kong, Godzilla, those are cryptids in their fictional universes, just as much as Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti, the Loch Ness Monster are in our real world, and there are also films about them. And I'm charting out how that storytelling template evolved, was codified, and how it works. So the first volume came out at the end of 2017. I've got 2 new volumes nearly done. Those will be coming out later this year and early next year, knock on wood. And I'm working on Tyrant. I scripted 2 brand new Tyrant stories. I visited Dr. Michael Ryan in Ottawa about 3 summers ago, 3 summers ago. I had to table the work after Michael and I went over it because as a teacher, you know, you guys teach. Do you have 2 months to do your own work? Maybe. But now that I'm retired, I'm getting back to that. And I had completely thumbnailed those 2 stories. Michael Ryan went over them with me to make sure that I'm adhering to the new paleontological record, because paleontology has changed a lot since the 1990s when I started work on Tyrant. And I'm hoping to have those out in some form by early next year. So I'm trying to stay busy, folks.
It sounds like, hey, let's just one more thank you for you, Stephen. We really appreciate it. I want to tell everybody thank you so much for coming out.
Thanks for
if you
having
like,
me, folks.
heck yeah, if you guys like what you saw, there's a lot more content over at jaxnconcon.org. We've got, I forgot to mention, John McCrae also drew Frankenstein's monster from Marvel, and he did it right as we were sitting there. It turned out great. Jimmy Palmiotti just jumped in there. He wasn't invited. I didn't invite him. I didn't know he was coming, but he's there asking John some process questions. So if you like that, and there's just tons of other cool stuff. We have a few events coming up. We have a chat about the Night of the Living Dead in a couple weeks, or you can just watch it and we get together and talk about its meaning in society, the fact and science fiction behind it. And then we've got the science fact and science fiction of Frankenstein coming up from a professor at Indiana University. So if you liked it, I'm glad you did, man. It was a dream of mine. I can't believe as a little kid that grew up in towns of 300 people that I actually got to meet Stephen and do this. So it was an honor for me. And Jackson College wants to thank you. I just want to do a shout out to our local comic shop. I don't think he's on here anymore, but Tim Stairs was on here. He helped to put it together and promote it. Our shout out to the library, who's one of our partners, and of course to the professors for involving us. So I think we're going to call it here, y'all. This will be up in a couple days. If you want to look through it again, there's some amazing materials that Stephen shared with us that we can ogle over and analyze and tear to pieces and love on our own time. So thank you so much to everybody. I think the professors and I and Stephen will just stay on real quick just so we can wrap it up. Everybody else, thank you so much.
Thanks,
Have a great
everybody.
one.
Bye, sir. Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.